very special word of welcome to all of our campuses. I'm honored to be with you and to everybody that's joining us online. Are you ready for some good news? You can't outrun God's grace, so you might as well not even try. Well, some time ago, I can't remember how long ago, I finally confessed to you publicly the dumbest thing I ever did. And some of you may not have heard it, and I dare to repeat it. Not because I want you to pity me, and not because I can make any amends for this moment of stupidity, but for making a point in almost anything to make my sermon point. The dumbest thing I ever did was in 1986. I had decided to go to a Presbyterian seminary in Atlanta. I'd been out of college for a couple years. I applied, and the seminary contacted me and said that they were proud of my academic resume and they wanted to offer me the one and only full ride scholarship to seminary. They give one to one incoming student. I was honored, and I turned it down because I thought maybe someone else deserved it better or could use it more than I. We had a little bit of money in the bank. My wife was going to be teaching school, and it was going to help pay the bills, and I thought maybe there'd be somebody else that would need it more. So I turned it down and instead paid all of my own expenses for seminary. And once I got into seminary, one of my best buddies, turned out he was the one who received the scholarship. He had more money than I did. And I began to wonder if I'd made a good decision. My wife, you can imagine, thought it was the dumbest thing ever, but what was she going to do about it? Many years later, when our kids were grown up enough to hear this painful story, my wife told them, "Your father turned down a full scholarship to seminary." My son said, "Dad, do you have any idea if you had taken that money instead and set it aside and invested it in the stock market, how much that might be worth today?" My daughter said, "Yeah, Dad, we could be rich." She goes, "Is this the reason I don't have a horse?" And I started thinking about the new golf clubs that I want, the hot tub I want, and how I promised my wife 10 years ago we'd redo the laundry room, and we haven't. And I couldn't help myself, but I shouldn't have. My wife is going to kill me when she hears the number, but I ran the numbers. If I had taken the money that I spent on seminary and instead had put it in the stock market in 1986 and just put it in and let it ride it out. I mean, it had to ride out a 1987 crash and the dot-com crash and the 2008 financial crisis and the COVID downturn. Ride it all out, it would be worth over $3 million. That would be more than enough for some new golf clubs, and I could donate at least $1 million to the For the Good campaign and have a couple $1,000,000 left over. Dumbest thing I ever did. And my kids and my wife remind me of it to this day. Well, before you get on me, how dumb that was, let me ask you, how well do you do when someone gives you a completely free gift? I'm not talking about some college scholarship or a year-end bonus from your employer where maybe you could go, well, I sort of deserve that. I'm talking about, no, like you were meeting with your good friend Susie for coffee in December, and she shows up and has a beautiful Christmas package wrapped up for you, and you have nothing for her, and she slides it across the table. And how do you feel about that? And you're saying, well, you shouldn't have, and you're opening it, and you're hoping maybe it's not that nice of a present, but it's some lovely earrings from the Kendra Scott store. I mean, not diamond earrings, but you know it's not Walmart. I mean, they're nice, and what do you say? You know, how do you do with that? Do you say, oh, you shouldn't have? Or do you say, I don't have anything for you. I'm sorry. I didn't know we were exchanging presents. Or do you just lie? Do you just lie and say, oh, I'm so sorry, your present is at home. And then on the way home, you stop by Belk and buy her a sweater. Whatever it is, I'm not alone in this. There's something that it's strangely difficult to accept an absolutely free and undeserved gift. And there's a word for an absolutely free, undeserved gift. The biblical word for that is grace. What is it that could be difficult about receiving grace? Why would we ever run from grace? And the more that I read the opening chapter of Jonah and this new little series we're in, and I think about his story, I realize that's what the story is about. The great prophet of God who is running not away from God's holiness or judgment, but running away from grace. And I want to invite you into this opening chapter and into, in some ways, the psyche of Jonah, because I think there we will learn about some of the ways that we are tempted to run away from grace. And I want to invite you into, once again, the life that receives lavishly from God what we don't deserve, His unmerited favor in Jesus Christ. So Jonah's on the run. Here it is, Jonah chapter 1, verse 1. The word of the Lord came to Jonah, the son of Amittai, saying, "Arise and go to Nineveh, that great city, and call out against it, for their evil has come up before me." But Jonah rose to flee to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. He went down to Joppa and found a ship going to Tarshish. So he paid the fare and he went down into it to go with them to Tarshish, away from the presence of the Lord. As we learned last time, Jonah was a well-known prophet. You can read about him in 2 Kings. He had a reputation as being a patriot. He had been at work with the king, getting revelation from God about how they could secure their borders against their arch rival Assyria. And God's told him to go to Nineveh, the center city of Assyria, this wicked nation. Tarshish, as we saw, is about as far away as you could get. God said to go to Nineveh, and he goes to Tarshish, and it's repeated 3 times. Tarshish, Tarshish, Tarshish. God said Nineveh, he said Tarshish, Tarshish, Tarshish. I want to get as far away as I possibly can from the presence of the Lord. And literally, this means the face of the Lord. It reminds me of Genesis chapter 4, the first family. Cain kills his younger brother Abel. And we read it, Genesis 4:16, Cain went away from the presence of the Lord. That's that same phrase, away from the face of the Lord. You can't escape the omnipresence of God, but that's a vivid image. Jonah was attempting to escape from being in the immediate presence of God. Why? 19th century Scottish author and preacher Hugh Martin asked this question, as every preacher has: why is he running? And you wonder, could it have been fear? The Assyrians were brutal. They tortured their captives. No, there's nothing in Jonah that comes across as him being a fearful type of prophet. Could it have been that he was just concerned that he would fail and no one would listen to him? That was one of Moses' complaints. But no, nothing reads like that in the book of Jonah. Or maybe it was the fact that they were Assyrians, that they were foreigners, and this is part of it. But as the story unfolds, you realize not even that is the reason that Jonah ran. And maybe it was that Jonah was worried about his reputation. He didn't want to be that guy, that prophet who had gone over and in any way helped the Ninevites. But no, it's not that or any of those reasons, because we know the reason. Jonah actually tells us the reason later in chapter 4, after he's been spewed onto dry ground from this big whale's mouth, and after he preaches in Nineveh, and the people of Nineveh repent and God spares them, Jonah has this to say in Jonah 4, verse 2. He prayed to the Lord and said, "O Lord, is this not what I said when I was yet in my country? That is why," he's explaining why, "that is why I made haste to flee to Tarshish. For I knew that you're a gracious God and merciful, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love, relenting from disaster." So Jonah is just saying, I ran because I was afraid that your grace would undermine the justice that I wanted to have happen against the Assyrians. The idea of people receiving free forgiveness despite their wickedness just seems too unfair. In other words, Jonah thought that grace would ruin everything. Jonah didn't run because God was so harsh. He ran because God was so kind. He wasn't running from judgment. He was running from grace. Why? Why do you run from grace? Why do we run from grace? Would we ever run from grace? Partly I think it's just that we get so accustomed to living with a law-based mentality that we're so used to transactional living. I do this and therefore you do this for me, that the idea of unmerited gift is something we're not comfortable with. Grace just doesn't feel right. I mean, that's the way life is a lot of times. It's just you get used to something. Do me a favor, just right now, just take your hands, put them together, the clasp, interlocking your fingers, like you would if you're just resting your hands together. And just hold them there for a second. My hands, the small finger on my right hand's on the outside, that little pinky finger's there. But do me a favor, take it now and clasp them differently with the fingers over one position. Reclasp it. That feels so funny to me. It's weird. I can't even do it. I can't even hold it there. It's too weird. It's so many things in life that you get used to the way it feels, and so because it feels normal to you, you assume it is correct. I think this is part of what happened with Jonah, and I think it's part of what happens to us. Jonah was a powerful prophet who grew up in an old covenant. The old covenant was a covenant of law in which God said through Moses, if you'll obey, then you'll be blessed. It doesn't mean that God wasn't also gracious. God had actually revealed himself through Moses and said, I am the Lord, and a God who's abounding in steadfast love. This is the very thing that Jonah was kind of quoting back to God and said, I knew you were a merciful God. But the covenant itself was a covenant of law with a system of sacrifices wherein in this shadow of the good gift that was going to come in Christ, you'd bring your sacrifices to God and it would temporarily be reckoned as if it covered your sin. So the mode of operation that Jonah had grown up with was an old covenant mentality. And the very thought of the Ninevites having a chance to receive grace, it just seems so far out of line with anything that Jonah would have ever been comfortable with. Sometimes things just feel so normal that to experience it differently feels like it just can't be right. I was thinking about a man who many, many years ago, not long after I had come to Renolda Church, he left the church. I didn't know why he'd left until about a year later. And he made an appointment and he came and explained to me. And he said, Pastor, he said, when you first came here and you started preaching grace, he said, I couldn't stand it. He said, I had to leave. He was running from grace. And he said, I was gone for 8 months and I went to a church where the message was much harsher. And one day I was sitting in church and the preacher was just basically yelling at us and kind of was a lot of shame. And all of a sudden, I said to myself, why am I here? And as soon as I said it, it was like the Lord brought back this memory to me of my childhood. Because every time I would disobey, he said, my mother would send me to my room and say, you wait there until your father comes home. And then my father would come home and take off his belt and he would beat me. And he said, I realized while I was sitting there getting another beating in church that I was gravitating towards the very thing I didn't need. And thankfully he was back and he began to understand grace. And it began to change his life. Just because something seems like it's so comfortable because it's what it's always been does not mean that it is correct. Jonah was in an old covenant, and this idea of unconditional, unmerited grace that's going to be poured out to the Ninevites, it just seemed like something that couldn't be right. It's because of this that I forever keep in front of you the gospel of grace. It's not the only message, but it's the center of our message. I feel like the great reformer Martin Luther who said, I need to listen to the gospel, which teaches me not what I must do. That's the role of the law. But what Jesus Christ, the Son of God, has already done for me, that he suffered and died to rescue me from sin and death. And Luther said, the gospel calls me to receive this and believe it. This is the heart of the gospel. It is the central truth of the Christian faith, and all true godliness flows from knowing it. So it's absolutely essential that we understand this truth well, teach it to others. This is the line I like. And beat it into their heads continually. This is why I beat it into your head continually. We run from grace because we're so comfortable with the law, because the law has been beaten in our heads since we were born in this world. It's a transactional world. And we need a whole new operating system. All right, I think Jonah's comfortable with it, and he runs from it, what seems different. But then there's this not just default to law, but default to shame. And it's on display here with Jonah. Shame is a deception. I call it a deception because the Bible teaches that we're in a spiritual battle and that the enemy, the devil, is an accuser and is called the father of lies. So the battleground is about truth. And so there's a great deception called shame, and it's a deep lie. And it says that as you are now, you do not measure up, and that's why you're not happy. And that's why you aren't really loved and accepted. It's because you're flawed, and therefore you can't really be fully loved as you are. So you need to be better than you are now. And you can either hide your flaws and pretend that you don't have them so that people will approve of you, or you can become perfect so people will approve of you, or you can realize you just are going to have to give up and just rebel and not care at all about any of your flaws. Watch this psychological process in Jonah as you watch his interactions with the pagan sailors. This big storm comes and hits, and the sailors, they're calling out to Baal or whoever their gods are, and they're looking for Jonah, like, where's this passenger Jonah? And at verse 5, you see Jonah had gone down to the inner part of the ship and had lain down and was fast asleep. I said last time, if you're fast asleep in the middle of a life-threatening storm, it's either because you have supernatural peace that passes understanding, or you've gotten so depressed you don't care. Joseph was unfortunately the latter. Sometimes shame makes you try harder and harder until you burn out and die. And sometimes shame makes you realize that you'll never be good enough, and so you don't even care if you die. So you can rebel and be destructive, or you can be depressed and be destructive, or you can wear yourself out with perfectionism. That's what shame wants to do to you. All of hell is fueled by shame. Watch what's revealed in this next section. Just look at what's going on in his soul. Verse 8, they said to him, tell us on whose account this evil has come upon us. What is your occupation? Where do you come from? What is your country? And what people are you? And he said to them, I'm a Hebrew, and I fear the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land. Then the men were exceedingly afraid, and he said to him, what is this that you have done? So they, like all the world, operates out of a transactional religious mentality. For the men knew that he was fleeing from the presence of the Lord because he told them. And then they said to him, what shall we do to you that the sea may quiet down for us? For the sea grew more and more tempestuous. And he said to them, pick me up, hurl me into the sea, and the sea will quiet down for you. For I know it's because of me that this great tempest has come upon you. This is the diabolical logic of shame. The storm proves that God is against me. This is his mentality. You see it here in this text. The storm is my fault alone. There's not any hope because the storm is too great and my failures have doomed me. I must pay for my sin. And so there must be some sacrifice I can make. That's the only way to please God and calm the storm. That's Jonah's thought process that's going on here. And it was every bit wrong. Every bit wrong. That's the thing that we know as the reader, is that the problem of believing a foundational lie, I don't measure up and therefore I can't be loved and accepted, when the truth is we don't measure up and we are flawed, but God has so loved us in Jesus Christ that He set His love on us while we were still in our sin. He died for us while we were still ungodly. But the problem with a foundational lie is then you just build layer upon layer on it, and you build a whole house of thoughts, which is like a stronghold, brick by brick, of thoughts that's built upon a lie. So it's all incorrect. It's all a deception. And that's what's going on with Jonah. Jonah thought the storm proved that God was against him, but the storm, we can tell from the story, was sent by God, and it was, verse 4, the Lord hurled a great wind upon the sea. But He sent the storm to begin the process of saving Jonah. The storm was the reason Jonah would be awakened. The storm would be the reason that Jonah winds up in the water and that a great fish comes, and that in the midst of that great fish he prays and he's put upon dry land and he prophesies to Nineveh. The storm was not sent to kill Jonah. The storm was part of the saving providence of God. Sometimes the storms in your life are God's gift. Do not let shame tell you that every time an adversity comes along, that this is proof that God's against me, that God doesn't like me, and that things don't work out for me. Jonah proves that wrong. And then Jonah says, it's because of me. Now, in one sense, that's right. The storm would have never arisen if it weren't for Jonah. But notice how all of it gets leveled in on, it's all about me. This is a form of self-absorption, is when the guilt-taking and the shame scapegoating gets so centered upon ourselves. It's all about me. Oh, really? Did any of it have to do with Nineveh and the great wickedness of Assyria? Did any of it have to do with anything other than Jonah? Of course it did. Jonah wasn't the whole problem, but he's thinking, this is the way shame says, it's all me. Right? The focus is on self. And Jonah thinks that his sin has doomed him, but of course the whole story is conveying that God is in a process of restoring him. It's a beautiful story of providence, of the way God has appointed the right moment and the right fish in the right way to save this prophet and restore his prophetic office so that he can fulfill his calling. That's what the story's about. Jonah thinks he's doomed, and just the opposite is happening. But shame tells him, you're doomed, and then says, you really have to pay for your mistakes. Shame always carries with it a voice to lead us toward self-condemnation. It is the goal of hell to get you into a mode of thought where you consistently condemn yourself and disqualify yourself, because that's the whole point of hell. And hell has limited resources. And once you've become so convinced that you can just turn on a tape player in your mind, a recording that is just condemning the self, then hell's accomplished its purposes. Jonah's shame says, you're condemned and you've got to pay for this. But the whole point of the story is the opposite, is that there is no payment that you can make here. There's no way that you, Jonah, are wealthy enough to cover this debt. This is what the Bible teaches. It's like we think somehow we're going to make it up to God. No, He's infinitely holy. And we, no matter what our level of sin, are compared to the infinite holiness of God. We're infinitely sinful comparatively. We're people who make $30,000 a year and we've racked up a $10 million debt. You could work the rest of your life at your $30,000 a year and you're never going to pay off your $10 million debt. The gospel doesn't say you've sinned and you need to pay. The gospel says you've sinned, you have a debt you can't pay, so receive my grace. Receive mercy. So Jonah is like, I'm condemned, I'm doomed, I've got to pay, and here comes the lie. So if I punish myself, suffer enough, sacrifice enough, it'll please God and stop the storm, so throw me overboard. Jonah is running from grace. It doesn't feel comfortable because it's not what his experience is. It's not his covenant. And his shame is screaming at him. But I want to show you something that's even, I think, deeper in Jonah's psyche that is making him run from grace. And this, beloved, if I could convey it to you, would change everything. You see it in the interaction with the sailors when they first start quizzing and pleading with Jonah. Look back at verse 8. They said to him, tell us on whose account this evil has come upon us. What is your occupation? And where do you come from? What's your country and what people are you? Now, Tim Keller has rich insights on this from which I've gleaned. And he points out that they're essentially asking, the sailors are asking him three things: Jonah's purpose, his place, and his people. His purpose, what's your mission? A lot of scholars think that the word for occupation here really means vocation or mission. What's your purpose? They're not just saying, what do you do for a living? Which Jonah never says, I'm a prophet. Never says anything about his purpose in this world, right? And what is your place? Where do you come from? And who are your people? What is your ethnicity? What's your race? And it's been noted that though the question about his race was the last question asked, it's the first one Jonah answered. Verse 9, he said to them, I'm a Hebrew. More than one scholar has pointed out that since Jonah answered first, I'm a Hebrew, that it is showing us something of the psyche of this depressed prophet. That though he's asked about his purpose in the world, he's asked about his people, that instead he speaks about his race and his ethnicity, that his identity, therefore, is, in the words of Tim Keller, too shallow. I like that. In other words, there are many components to your identity, but what's at the foundation of it? If someone says, who are you? And if it is that you're primarily defined by an ethnicity or even a lineage or by something that you do, then your identity has not become what God wants. I told you some time ago about a pivotal moment in our daughter's life as she's emerging from adolescence into adulthood. When our daughter Abby went to college, her first week of orientation, I told you this not long ago, but it so illustrates it, I tell it again. The students met in groups and they had an orientation in this big secular university with all of its, expansive liberal thoughts and all that she was getting exposed to, our sweet homeschool girl. And I wasn't worried about her going to she was secure, her faith was solid, but I knew it would be a shocking twist of environment for her. In her first couple of weeks of orientation, there it was. And the orientation leader got these 17 and 18-year-old young people into a circle and gave them a presentation on identity and the different kinds of things that can form your identity. And she started, the leader did, by modeling it and said, I identify as queer, I identify as a woman, and she is on a sports team of some game that in a Harry Potter movie. And then she said, okay, that's my identity. And each of you have 6 words to give your identity. And so they started going around the circle and people were saying words about their gender orientation and about maybe their family or maybe about what hobbies they had to try to identify themselves. And Abby must have been the Holy Spirit because when it came her turn, the 6 words that she decided to share were, I am a child of God. You just can't have a better identity statement, biblically speaking, because the way that God identifies you is not by what you have done for God. That's transactional. That is anti-grace. But the way that God identifies you is by what He's done for you. Even to call yourself a Christian is to be a Christ one. And the way that God identifies you is that He came in the person of Jesus Christ to die a death that we all deserve to die and to experience the hell that we should have experienced on our behalf so that justice would be served and the great heart of God to be kind and merciful to you would be released such that you would become the recipient of love and grace. And as the opening chapter of John's Gospel says, to believe on Him and have the right, therefore, to become a child of God. So the way God identifies the Christian is you are my child. And to say you are my child is for God to say, I have adopted you. It is, to use another image, I have brought you into the family. And you've been born anew, and you have become mine. So that the definition of your life is that you belong to God. I am a child of God. Who are you, Jonah? What's your mission? Who are your people? And Jonah says, I'm a Hebrew. It's too shallow. It's too flimsy. And it's missing the point. He'd at least been better to say, I'm a prophet of the living God. You know, he'd at least been better to say, I'm on a mission because God speaks to me and I share His word. He'd be better off to have something like that. But instead, he starts with his ethnicity. He acknowledges that he fears the Lord. But the real answer, the deep answer, the non-flimsy answer, the non-superficial answer is, I am a child of God. And I belong to the Lord of the universe. And He loves me. The primary way that Paul addressed Christians in the first century, the primary identity statement that he spoke over them again and again was the beautiful Greek word agapetos, or in the plural, agapetoi. And it is translated beloved. Agapetos is taken from the word agape, that unconditional love of God that in the Old Testament was called chesed. In the New Testament it's called agape. The love that only comes from God. The unmerited favor of God and kindness of God. And so who you are is you're an agapetos. You are a recipient of the love of God. To all those in Rome, Romans 1:7, who are loved by God, that's agapetos. Philippians 4:1, therefore, my brothers whom I love, that's speaking Paul's words, but then he says at the end, stand firm in the Lord, my beloved, agapetoi. 2 Corinthians 7, even when he is bringing correction, since we have these promises, beloved, let us cleanse ourselves. Beloved, agapetoi. That's who Jonah is. He's agapetos of God. But he didn't know it. He didn't know it. And he was going down. That's one of the words you just see repeated. He went down to Joppa. He went down into the boat. He's going to go down into the ocean. And he's eventually going to go down into the belly of a whale. He's down. He's down. He's going further down. And it's not until Jonah is actually in the belly of some great fish that the miracle takes place, where now none of his ethnicity, none of the fact that he's Hebrew rather than Assyrian, neither his prophetic status or his place in the royal court, and not his high religious standing, none of that means anything when you're in the belly of a whale. We'll look in detail at this next time, but in chapter 2, this is part of what Jonah prayed in the belly of that fish. We're going to see a lot of rich things in this prayer, but here's part of it. Verse 6, to the roots of the mountains I went down. He's talking about how low he went. To the land whose bars closed upon me forever. Yet you brought up my life from the pit, O Lord my God. When my life was fainting away, I remembered the Lord. I think he's saying, I remembered His kindness. I remembered His great love. I remembered His goodness. And my prayer came to you in your holy temple. And he has this astounding revelation in verse 8. Those who pay regard to vain idols forsake their hope of steadfast love. Those who pay regard to vain idols forsake, they forfeit, they miss out on, they run away from the steadfast love of God, the chesed of God, the grace of God. I think what happened was Jonah, when his life reached the bottom, that's the pit, where there's everything else stripped away from him, except the love of God, that he sees finally what really matters. It's not your ethnicity. It is not your education. It is not any of those things that you might want to hold on to. Because, beloved, if your identity is you're a courageous person, the moment that you're cowardly, you've lost your identity. Or if your self-identity is you're a successful person, what about when you fail? Where is your identity? Our identity is only sure. Our identity is only joyful. Our identity is only true if we come to realize I am a child of God. You are the agapetoi. You are the beloved of God. The definition of your life, like Jonah had to discover, is you are a recipient of the grace and the love of God in Jesus Christ. That's who you are. Beloved. To me, this is the surest way, the most important means by which you could live without ever running from the grace of God. And that's not by you saying, oh, I deserve good things. It's not by you somehow proving yourself worthy. It's the exact opposite. It's like Jonah, where you're in the pit and you realize the only real identity that I could ever count on is to be loved by God. And once you get up in the morning and say, I might not deserve it, but I am the beloved of God, you'll never then run away from grace. Let your heart come to the wondrous, glorious revelation that it's all grace, all by grace. When you quit running from grace, you're less likely to say no to a full scholarship. But more importantly, you're less likely to ever say no to the good gifts of God. The gospel is an invitation to stop running from grace and get up every day and run towards it. That's the story of Jonah, and that's the gospel.